Hello.
Hey, thanks for the flexibility today.
No problem. I'm glad that we were still able to make it work.
Totally. So the recorder is on and you're solid to start?
Great.
Oh.
Which thing should I talk about first?
Well, I have some questions prepared for you.
Great.
First, I want to establish it's Saturday, November 2nd, in the 1:44 in the afternoon. This is an interview with this UMBC former student known as Anna, thus far in my work and documentation.
Mm-hmm.
So,
I just said, sorry. Yes.
So, what years were you a student at UMBC, and what years were you an RA?
So I attended UMBC as an undergraduate from 2009 to 2013, and I was an RA starting in 2011 to 2013.
And can you talk about what happened on the night when you interacted with Officer Sexton as an RA, which you first told me about a year ago?
Yes. So I was with a friend of mine who was also an RA in the same building. I was not on duty that night, but my friend was. We were in a class together, so we were studying together. And whenever it was time for rounds, I believe it was either second or third rounds. It was later in the evening. And I decided to accompany my friend. While we were walking in the hallways, out of the corner of our eye, sort of around the corner, we saw a girl being dragged into a room by a young man and the door closing behind them. So, basically just saw her on her back, being dragged by her feet into a room, and then the door closing. We knocked on the door, and nobody answered. And, we became very alarmed and suspected, that she might not be well in some way. We didn't know what was happening with her at the time, but definitely were concerned, if she was sick, intoxicated, if she, was aware of what was happening to her, essentially. So we called the CD on duty and we called the police. And when the police came a few minutes later, it wasn't a very long response time, maybe, 10 minutes. Officer Sexton was the one who responded, and he walked right up to me and said, for being passed out, you sure do look pretty good. And alluding to the fact that he understood that the reason that we called the police was because we thought a young girl might be in some kind of danger. And he decided to make a joke that was really jarring for me to hear, being concerned and responding to an incident in a paraprofessional capacity. And so I was kind of floored at that point, and I don't remember, what I responded, but I know that I tried to redirect him to the incident. And so, the police knocked on the door. The girl's boyfriend answered and introduced himself as such and said, my girlfriend's just a little bit sick. She's fine. And closed the door on us. And Officer Sexton... Yeah.
Can I interrupt you for a moment to ask
Absolutely, yes.
About a detail that you shared with me previously?
Yes.
You said that you waited quite a while between the cops' arrival and them actually going to check on the young woman. What would you say that amount of time was like? Because you said that they were joking around with you for a while before they responded to the emergency.
They were joking around for a while. I would say... because essentially what happened was, even though we were continuously knocking on the door, nobody was answering that bedroom door until the police came, knocked, introduced themselves as the police a few times, and then we got that door opened. So between when they arrived and between the time that we actually got a door open and somebody was talking to us, maybe 20 minutes. And
how long was it between when the police arrived and when the police tried to knock on the door?
maybe 10 or 15 minutes. So they kind of, they understood that we were knocking. I believe that we were still knocking during that time, but they did not officially do, the cop knock, if you will, and introduce themselves. And that's eventually what elicited the opening of the door. And that's not unusual for UMBC students to ignore knocking from Res Life officials and then only open the door when it's the police.
So the timeline of events was such that you said you called the police. They arrived pretty much immediately. They spent, or Sexton made that comment to you about your appearance. The police talked to you for 10 or 15 minutes. Then they went to knock on the door. And then how long was it between the first attempt to knock on the door and it succeeding?
Maybe 5 or 10 minutes. It
With
definitely wasn't
there,
immediate.
It took 5 or 10 minutes for the students in the dorm room to respond to the police at the door.
Yeah, I know they had to knock more than once. They made it known that the police were there, did not answer on the first attempt, and then we were like, listen, we're not leaving, and if we have reason to believe that somebody is in danger, we need to see that person's okay. And then I think once it was understood that the situation was not going to just go away, the door opened, a young man came out, and he said, hi, my girlfriend wasn't feeling well. I was trying to help her get to the bathroom, and that's where she is now. And closed the door on us, and, at that point, Officer Sexton had been very nonchalant about the whole situation and basically said, this happens all the time. I don't really think it's anything to worry about. And I found that attitude very alarming, but he still remained on the scene.
He said that phrase. He said, this happens all the time.
He said, it's something along the lines of like, kids drink too much all the time. And he was referring to like her being sick from alcohol.
At that point, did he know that she was seen being dragged into a room by her feet?
Yes.
Okay.
And so, what was alarming to me was that he had a very relaxed attitude about the whole situation, and, knowing that we weren't sure if she was drugged. We weren't sure if she was assaulted. We weren't sure if she had epilepsy and was having a seizure. You know what I mean? Like, we didn't know what was going on. And he seemed very unconcerned despite the fact that he was there going through the motions of his job. So did he respond? Yes. Did he knock? Yes. And so, since I was second on duty, often what happens, since I was, second, to the person on duty, I was sent home essentially like away from the scene. Like once they figured out that the police were handling it, and I was really disturbed. I was like, is he even taking this seriously? And, I checked the records of the person who was the first responder, and what happened after I left, unbeknownst to me.
So, can I pause you and ask,
yes,
was the person who you were reporting to also sent home, and was that person a student or not?
So the person who was on duty rounds with me, the RA on duty, was also a student. They were not sent away, and I believe eventually a community director also came, because whenever the police are called, the community director on duty also shows up. So when I was sent home, the people that were left on the scene were the RA on duty, the community director, and the police.
Do you remember what community director, like the person's name?
I don't remember.
Do you remember the names of any other police who were there?
I don't believe that there were any other police there.
It was just Sexton by himself from beginning to the time that you left. Okay.
Yeah. And so after I left, what the person who was on duty said was that eventually when the girl, I guess, was able to speak. She came out of the bathroom, said, "I drank too much. This is my boyfriend. He was just helping me in whatever way he could get inside, and everything's fine." And from what my friend who was on duty said, that was legitimate. It wasn't that she said that in front of him. They kind of pulled her aside and made sure that she had a chance to say whatever she wanted in confidence, and she reassured everybody that
who
everything
pulled her
was fine.
aside, the RA or the police?
That is a detail that I do not know, but from the way that my friend stated it, it made it sound like the community director and or police, one of the adults responding, wanted to speak to her not in the presence of her boyfriend to make sure that she wasn't being coerced into saying that.
I'd appreciate it, if it's at all possible, if you could reach out to the friend and see what you could find out about that detail, whether it was the police or the community director who pulled her aside as an individual.
Mm-hmm. From what I remember of the documentation that remains from that night, which only my friend documented the incident, I ended up not documenting it. I was supposed to, but since I was only present for the duration of the incident where nobody was really speaking to us, my friend was like, "Listen, I was there for the whole thing. I've got it covered. I know the story beginning to end, and it looks really different from how it ended up." And so I said, okay. And, I let them write it. But if I remember correctly, the documentation wasn't explicit about who it was that was pulled aside. It just said, the female student in question was pulled aside.
And when was this night? What was the year and season? As specific as you can get.
It was my first fall semester as an RA, so that would have been, I believe when I actually was working was 2012, fall of 2012, close to the beginning of the school year. And this was in Patapsco.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So
and that was a year that Patapsco was notoriously known for having a lot of duty calls and incidents and things like that.
Notorious in what circles? Amongst RAs or amongst students in general?
Students in general. That was kind of considered like the party dorm.
When you say duty calls, do you mean assault allegations specifically, or do you mean
just general incidents that an RA would have to be called for? Particularly noise complaints, a lot of parties, but definitely situations that were either really, there were a lot of students involved, or were alarming in some way. I think there were a couple of, medical incidents that were kind of puzzling, but, just students getting themselves into shenanigans,
Got you.
Because it was a freshman dorm, and so, anytime there would be a big party in a freshman dorm, all kinds of things pop up.
That makes sense. My anecdotal evidence can confirm.
Yes. No, and you hear students calling it Patap that Asco a lot. That was what it was called. Or just
I remember that.
Hot Tapsco, weed.
I remember that.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think we were there a couple years apart.
No, and that's the thing is, it was truly a couple years before I was there, and then a couple years after I was placed in another building. It was many, many years of everybody understanding that if you lived there, you probably didn't get very good sleep.
I stayed in Patapsco often. I never lived there, but some of my good friends did, and I ended up crashing with them a lot, and I can confirm.
Yes, it's always where, and it was one of the older buildings that when I worked there, they had just put the new addition onto it, but especially when it was one of the rundown buildings, because it was kind of so old and crappy, you know what I mean, that people will just trash it, whereas you wouldn't see that much in, let's say, Erickson, for example, which was very new, and it was, kind of like the sought out spot for people trying to get, a first year dorm. And I think after that, it was no longer open to first year students. I think they purposely put first year students in the more rundown buildings.
So, in your correspondence with your friend who oversaw this entire event, can you remind me where you were in your account, I guess, of your dialogue with him and where your account hinges on his memory?
Yes. So essentially, what I had told you last year and what I had written to you, there is no information that's incorrect there. It's simply that I left the scene before it resolved. So when I reached out to my friend and I said, hey, I want to make sure that what I'm remembering is correct, because this is something that I'm remembering many years later, he said, yeah, I remember that you were really shaken up by the way that whole thing unfolded. And I wanted to reassure you that, even though jokes were made, even though it seemed like it wasn't taken seriously, it was, because this is a person who I very much trust. It's a close friend of mine from school who, not somebody who would be nonchalant about assault, somebody who would take that very seriously. And so when he told me, listen, I know how it looked when we got there, it resolved much better, and I don't think that you're remembering that because you weren't there for that. And I do think that it affected my judgment for the whole night, to hear that comment from Officer Sexton. I think it just really threw me at the time. And I mean, I was, 19, thinking that there was like a very serious incident happening. And, it's one of those, like, you call the police and you expect them to help and you don't have any other thought of like what else they might do. So to hear that and to hear him, like, the way that I felt was either insinuating that, that there really was no incident if the RA on duty is the one, trying to get attention or something, or that the situation is funny and that it's not serious.
I definitely understand where you're coming from in the reaction to being sexualized by a UMBC cop. Because I'd like to, let you know and state it for the record that, speaking from personal experience, I had a UMBC cop make a sexualizing comment to me as a student, and I was so out of my mind shocked. I would never in a million years have expected that. I would have expected all other kinds of, disrespect, but I figured they would at least know that's something they can't get away with.
No, and it kind of
I pushed back against it too. I talked to somebody else in the department. I'm going to go back and see if I can find a more thorough account of what happened at some point when I can get into my old computer. But I remember that I tried to talk to somebody else in the department, and they were very dismissive.
So if I could switch gears, because this is where the two incidents that I told you about kind of connect. There was, as part of residential life, there was a training that we covered, on assault, and during a time that I had been abused by a partner who was not a UMBC student. He was off campus, but hearing about statistics on assault was very triggering for me, and I was visibly upset. And one of the, I would guess, higher officials in student life pulled me aside. She saw that I was crying, and she said, is there anything that you'd like to tell me? And, I disclosed to her that I had been abused for several months and that I feared my safety, that I, had attempted to leave this person, and that I was essentially being stalked on campus. And she said, would it make you feel safe to have this person banned from campus? And I said, yes. And she said, just, double checking. You said he wasn't a student here. And I said, no, he's not. Like, not even close, I believe was the words that I used. She said, okay, I'll need a written statement from you saying that, this person harmed you in some way, and we will put it through to the police and make sure that if he steps one foot on this campus that he would be arrested. And, I burst into tears even more at that point and was just so grateful that such swift action was taken, and it required relatively little of me and that I was believed. I think that it was very reassuring. And so, she checked with me and said, is there anything else that you'd like to share with me? Have you had any other experiences of being assaulted on this campus? Like, we take this so seriously. And I said, thankfully, I've never been assaulted, by anybody on campus. She's like, have you ever had any problems with anybody? And I said, well, I was sexually harassed by a police officer, Officer Sexton. And she looked at me and she looked down at her hands and she nodded. And I said, have you heard this before? And she said, yes. And I said, well, that's really unfortunate. It was documented. I did report it to my direct supervisors, and I referenced it in my rehire letter. In residential life, I referenced the incident, but not, being harassed specifically. And, it's something that I've never been quiet about, but it's also something that seemed like, the harm in an inappropriate comment is so minimal that it wasn't addressed. And even, if it had been addressed, what could they really do besides say, like, don't say that, So I think it was just like, it was such a mild, like, microaggression that it was kind of acknowledged that, like, okay, this has happened. And, at the time, I was disclosing my own assault and things that were so much more heavy and held much more gravity that it just kind of paled in comparison to saying that I had been, physically abused and sexually abused and stalked. But she was very interested in knowing if anything else had happened to me. But when that's what I said, it was kind of like, okay, this is something we are aware of. And,
That's the line. That's the line where you shouldn't expect further action to be taken.
Yeah.
Was the gist of what she was saying.
Yeah, like that, okay, he made one comment to you one time and he didn't, outright do anything to you to harm you. And, she was kind of thorough in finding out, like, what were your other interactions? What else happened? And it's like, how do you quantify this person is creepy? How do you quantify?
Is there anything else that he did that made him seem creepy? Like, did he visibly, oogle your body? Did he do something like that that's harder to report?
Oh, yeah. I mean, during, he was a huge part of RA training. And he was very involved with a lot of the school spirit stuff. And I don't remember if he went to the school. I think he might have been an alumni, but I know that he had worked there for many years. And he was the guy who would look you up and down, and you're like, why is this adult man, looking me up and down, or like licking his lips at me, or, doing something that it takes a second, and he does it in broad daylight in public. And you know that, like, the reason he can get away with it is because he's so brazen, and, like, nobody else in a room is going to be looking at him when you two are making eye contact, and he does that. And so, at various points during RA training or during student life events, I would see him, and he would just look at me in a way that made me feel really uncomfortable.
So he licked his lips at you?
Yeah.
How many kinds of interactions like this with Sexton did you have?
maybe 3 or 4. It wasn't numerous, mostly because I stayed the fuck away from the police at any chance that I could, even if I was responding to an incident. Like, because that happened so early in my career as an RA, that for me set the tone for a culture where I could not count on the people that were supposed to be keeping us safe to keep us safe. And, I think he might have been the responder at one other incident that I was at. And otherwise 1 or 2 of the trainings that either he facilitated or he was a part of for some reason, you could just see him looking around the room, like, eyeing up all the girls. And it was just like, he was so fucking gross.
So when you say he was that guy, you mean he had a reputation for doing that and you heard about it from other people, from other students?
I asked my friends, I'm like, do you think this guy is creepy? And they were like, oh yeah, like he, like, walks around here, kind of like with this certain swagger, like he owns student spaces. And I do think that he was an alumni or something like similar. He was.
He told me in an interview that I did for a school project many years ago.
He seemed very proud of that. And I wanted to make sure, and that's the thing, is like, I really don't feel comfortable saying things until I know, that they've been verified, because I will fully own that I had a very emotional reaction to the actions that he took towards me that night. And, but I do remember him just having a sense of ownership over the student body that just seemed so bizarre to me that the other officers did not display.
So how many different times or to how many different staff members at the school did you discuss the sexton behavior with?
I discussed it with the person who was responding to the incident in Patapsco with me, and
what was that person's position?
He was an RA.
So he was another student.
He was another student, also a first-year RA. We were hired the same year, and we were given the same placement, and we had the same major, and so a lot of the time, even if I wasn't on duty, because it was such a crazy building, like, if you had an RA friend, you would ask them to do rounds with you, because there wasn't a single round that you wouldn't have to deal with something.
So you told me that you raised your concerns about sexton's behavior once to someone who you were reporting to in your position as an RA, and one other time to this professor or administrator who had the person banned who was abusive to you.
Yes, the administrator who had the person banned. That was the person, that I said, sextons sexually harassed me, and looked at me, looked down, kind of sighed and nodded, and said, something along the lines of, that's not the first time I've heard that, or other people have said similar.
Would you be comfortable giving me any more information about what this person's position was, or like what the purview of their job was?
She was very high up in student affairs, so upper level administration, like a staple of student life.
And who was it that you tried to report or discuss your concerns about sexton's behavior with?
The person who was also responding as an RA. So the person who I went on rounds with.
So the RA and the high-level administrator are the only 2 times you've brought that up in a professional capacity?
Yes. The other times
were
anecdotal and were with, friends on campus, like women, and being like, has Officer Sexton ever been creepy to you? And they were just like, yeah, he's like weirdly full of himself and, walks around and just is, ogling everybody, or is, it's really difficult to describe that. It was almost like the other police officers understood that they were there doing a job, and that Sexton would show up and try and act like he was one of the gang, and like he was still a student because he was once a student. Like, he would speak to me not as a police officer, but he would speak to me as if I was his peer.
Can you give some examples?
So during RA training, which we have twice a year, if he was giving a presentation with another police officer, usually the adults in the room speak amongst themselves during breaks, and maybe, the RAs or whoever is kind of like clumped together. And I remember, he would make a distinguished effort to talk to the students and to be very friendly with them in a casual way, not in a way that related to the training. Kind of like trying to make friends.
So back to your attempt to raise this behavior with a high-level administrative official, and the juxtaposition between that response and that administrator's response to handling the peer, the person your age who'd been abusive to you. What do you think was the cause for the difference? What was the position of the person who was banned? That person, I think, had no campus affiliation.
No campus affiliation. So the difference really was that what happened with Sexton was words, and what happened with the person who had done this to me was actual physical actions that were threatening to my safety. And I don't feel confident saying she said this exactly, but what I understood when I reported the thing about Sexton to this higher level administrator was that this is not a new accusation, that he has been talked to in some capacity about it, and that if it's not more severe, that there's not really anything else they can do besides say, like, hey, don't say that. And she made sure to ask me multiple times, like, and he did not physically, present aggression towards you. He did not, put you in a position of coercion. Like, he didn't do anything. And I was like, no, he didn't I called for help because I was afraid that a girl was in danger. And he came and he made a joke about my body.
Did you tell her that he waited 10 to 15 minutes between arriving to even attempt to knock on the door where there was a reported possible assault happening?
I told her that he wasn't taking me seriously, but I did not mention the response times because a lot of that had to do with the fact that the students have to consent to having their door opened if the police don't have either a warrant or a serious reason to enter. Like us seeing that
I'm asking
wasn't
about
enough
the
to break down their door.
time between the cops' arrival and the cops attempting to knock for the first time.
Yeah, I at that time, again, this was a day that I was caught, like, crying in the middle of a training and was essentially comparatively speaking about something that I considered to be more of a legitimate threat to my safety. Like, the thing with Sexton, I presented as inappropriate and obnoxious, but as I'm sure you and many other women are aware, that's everyday stuff for us in this age. And so when it comes to, like, a daily microaggression versus something that I genuinely, it was threatening my life, like having my abuser banned from campus, I think genuinely saved my life. It's just a different story. It's which one do you want to, pursue? Which one is the real threat here? And a gross old man saying something gross to you is just something that every woman has to deal with. And I don't agree with that, but that's just kind of, that's how it is. I don't want it to be that way, but that is how it is.
Can I depart from tradition and tell you how I feel about that for a moment?
Sure.
It seems to me that women in general, and in my experiences responding to the problems at UMBC, are made to feel like you have to choose what battles to fight because some degree of violation is going to happen. So just start at that baseline. That's where your expectations should be. So there's no point in fighting things that are perceived as smaller. And I would argue that no one starts off assaulting people in the worst possible way. They realize that some degree of behavior, of inappropriate behavior, is acceptable, and it escalates, and they keep finding that there's no boundaries until they realize they can get away with something like that. I absolutely agree with you. It's like a beach pool.
Yes.
So I greatly appreciate your strength in talking about all this right now. And getting into the nitty-gritty of the intersection of the many experiences of hypersexualized, demeaning treatment that we have both experienced in our time at university.
Yeah.
So going forward with this account and wrapping this up, I just want to clarify some of the details here with what exactly happened chronologically on the night Sexton responded.
Yes.
Now that I have a more thorough account of this than I ever had, I just want to make sure that I lay out a thorough timeline that you've confirmed.
Yeah, and thank you for also checking with me. I do want to make it very clear that the first time I spoke with you, I was going just off of my own memories, and that since that time, I've been able to see my partner's firsthand account that was written that evening of what happened. And I think that part of the reason that I did not end up documenting it, aside from the fact that, they told me I was off the hook, you don't have to, you were only here for part of it, this person was here for the whole thing, that's enough. I really do think that it made me feel either whiny or illegitimate, or that the blame would come back to me in a negative way because I had just started this job, and I was like, I didn't want to be the person who was seen as just complaining about something minor, on one of the first incidents. I don't know. There was a lot contributing to why I didn't document, but because of that, I do want to clarify as much as I can.
Well, I greatly appreciate you going back and doing that digging, and if your friend decides that he'd be willing to talk to me, be it anonymously or otherwise, I'd always be glad to be able to hear from him and incorporate, his narrative into the body of what we know about what happened.
Yeah, I tried, and he has vehemently refused.
So going forward with the pieces of the story that we do have and are able to document. So that night, Sexton arrived, and he spent 10 to 15 minutes joking around before he made the first attempt to knock on the door where the reported assault had happened. Is that correct?
Yes.
So throughout that period of time, throughout that 10 or 15 minutes, how often did you attempt to redirect Sexton to the situation in the dorm room?
So what happens when we call the police, and there's two people on duty, one person stays where the incident is occurring, and the other person has to go to the front desk and escort the police officer to the exact part of the building that you're in. You don't have to do that, but the reason that is frequently done is because the students know the layout of the dorms sometimes, better than the police do. And so if I say, okay, I'm in the East Wing, 204, an RA is gonna, because we have to do that duty round every single night, that exactly where that is. And so I stayed at the closed door, and my partner went and retrieved Officer Sexton and they both came up together, and he was very nonchalantly trying to gather information. He said, okay, this is what I heard from the call. And, of course, he opened everything with that comment towards me and then said, what's going on? We told him, hey, we saw this happening. And he was asking us questions, like he was trying to find out more information about what it was, but was very casual about it, did not seem concerned, did not act with a sense of urgency, and talked to us, joked with us for that 10 or 15 minutes before knocking and attempting to elicit a response from the room. So, he was doing his job in terms of, checking off the boxes, but it's not how I would have expected a professional to respond to that situation. And I think that was, this is a speculation very clearly, but that seemed purposeful to me. That seemed calculated in a way to where he understood that if this came out in writing, no, I asked you guys what was going on. I knocked. I talked to the students. And it's yeah, you did that, but you did that in a way that showed that you had made up your mind about the outcome the moment that you arrived. Do you know what I mean? It's so hard for me to describe. But...
Well, the reality of the situation is that were there an assault going on, there would be a 10 to 15 minute period when that assault was happening when a police officer was standing outside the dorm building talking.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the heart of what I find deeply troubling about the account that you gave me.
Yeah.
Well, it seemed...
I was going to say, I remember having much more purpose and direction and being okay, the police are coming. I need to tell them what's going on. And the second he made that comment, what I remember after that is becoming very red-faced, tears welling up in my eyes, looking down at the ground and not saying anything for several minutes and just letting my partner talk to him.
That's so wildly unacceptable.
I agree.
And I just want to make space right now, if you do want to share how this experience affected your feelings of safety and your own personal growth at UMBC and beyond. If you want to talk about that, I'd be glad to be able to hear that and facilitate, making it a matter of record if that's something you want to do. If that's not, that's also beyond understandable, but I wanted to put that space there now.
Thank you. I think that it did affect my feelings of safety at UMBC because from then on, if we had an officer have to respond to an incident, I remember just crossing my fingers and hoping that it would not be him, because I didn't feel that he took me seriously. I didn't feel that he took the safety of young women on campus seriously, and that wasn't my experience across the board. Definitely other UMBC police officers were very courteous and understood that they were performing a job for public safety, but I did not feel safe after that, thinking that he could be the one responding. And it made me, at that point, from then on, I became very vocal among the residential life community about the shortcomings of the police and about the importance of documenting. And I think my regret for not having directly documented that incident out of shame or guilt or believing that it was my fault, that fueled me, and I was unpopular for being outspoken in that way. And I was told many times by supervisors, listen, you can't bash the police like this because they are our partners. They help us respond to things. And if you had a bad experience with one, I got the bad apple talk thrown at me.
How many different supervisors did you talk to about the night that Sexton responded at Patapsco?
I did not refer to that night specifically. I would just say general statements like, the police are not trustworthy, the police are inappropriate, the police are a joke, and I would just be like, you can't trust them. And they would be like, you can't make sweeping generalizations like that. And I'm like, And that's the thing is, like, that's what was so puzzling to me is that, like, in school, we were learning so much about, corruption and what institutional bias looks like and the way that is covered up, and being encouraged to be outspoken and to name injustice where we see it. And then in the very same institution where I was employed to be able to cover that education, being inadvertently asked to accept it. That was just so puzzling to me.
It's clear to me that something has to change at the foundational level about what we accept.
Yeah.
What we accept in our educational institutions, what behavior we accept in society at large. And I can tell you from personal experience, I beyond agree that the hypersexualization of women and, girls, in this case, college students being hypersexualized by people that are supposed to be adults taking care of them, is way too broadly accepted as an inevitability and not something that we have a control over and that we as a society can choose to set standards and expectations about.
Yeah. No, and, I think it does, I think it is important to mention that during this time, I had been deeply traumatized by somebody who was not on campus, and that incident where he was banned was the first time that I felt legitimate in saying anything, and it was instrumental to my healing. And at the same time, like, one incident that can be so pivotal to me feeling like my feelings are valid, understanding that my safety is important, seeking other kinds of help and seeking barriers to protect myself from this person, how at the same time, wrapped up in that incident, I was dismissed, with my concerns about Officer Sexton and told, oh, we've heard this, he's been talked to. Anything else?
That's such an incredibly complicated knot to untangle.
Isn't it? Like, and that's the thing is, like, I think that people hear the students protesting, and they think, oh, you must hate this place. You must have had a terrible experience. And it's like, for the record, I loved my time at UMBC.
Right,
the people that I met there have changed my entire life. I graduated from undergraduate career in 2013, and I still keep in touch with multiple professors and students. Many people who I worked with at UMBC are currently still my references for jobs. I had a great time there, and I love that place, and I just want to make it safe for the people who understand what it is never to feel safe.
That resonates with me. Yeah, I had such a deeply positive experience there in so many ways, and that's why it horrified me so deeply to hear anecdotally from so many other of my peers that they didn't feel safe when they raised the issue of sexual harassment or sexual assault with the police. And it terrified me because the school had become somewhere that I was thriving and growing and felt deeply at home. And prior to hearing these stories, did feel deeply safe. And having to come to terms with the reality that it wasn't what I thought it was, and that it wasn't truly a place that was safe to me, and it wasn't truly a place that would protect me when I'd done nothing wrong, and that it, at that point, it logically would not have been reasonable to assume the administration and the police would protect me, and that no matter how much I loved being there, I had to internalize that for my own ability to protect myself. That was a very painful coming of age for me.
I really relate to that and feel for you. And, I think during this whole process, something that has been really important to me is that the person who I'm speaking with, the person in charge of this effort to record student experience is somebody who has very closely mirrored my life experience. I'm not talking to a, New York Times journalist who, doesn't even understand what UMBC is. Like, you have this picture of the culture of what it's like to be a student in the several years that we both attended. And, I think that changes it. I think that getting that inside perspective is something that can be very powerful, and that I've appreciated the hard work that it's taken for every single person who has had a part in this.
Thank you. And I deeply appreciate that. And I feel like that's a really important part of the story for the outside world to understand. Like, I was just giggling with you about Patapsco being known as a party dorm because in my own experience, it was in a way that was safe. And that shouldn't be conflated with the violence against women that can also happen in those spaces. And when I first spoke to you, hearing that story was so terrifying to me because I was picturing going back to Patapsco to go sleep in a sleeping bag in my best friend's dorm room so I would wake up on campus, the next day. And I was picturing entering the building and seeing this woman being dragged into the dorm by her feet and the adults around me not taking it seriously. And I felt that terror of picturing what would I do if I stepped into that building and saw that happening. So...
And it's like, I think there might have even been an extra layer of like, I took this job, yes, of course, to pay for school, no duh. But also, like, to be an RA, you really have to, like, give a shit about other people. Like, it's very difficult to do that job and just, like, absolutely not care at all. And I'm a person who, I give a shit if other people are suffering. And so when I saw that, it was like, not only is that scary, but this is something that I'm supposed to try and prevent, and it's my job to step in. And so it was like, I felt like, I don't know how to describe the invalidating feeling that I got from hearing Sexton make a joke about my appearance. It was just like I'm not doing my job right, or that it's my own fault that somebody would say that to me, or just that my concerns are not real. It's so many things. There's many layers. I could talk to you for hours about it.
Let's have that conversation off the record and end the recording here.
Sounds good.
Thank you for all your time and the, emotional energy it took to recount all that. And I hope you have a fantastic weekend and get to take some time to take care of yourself.
Thank you. I appreciate that, and I hope you do the same.
Thank you.